One of the reasons why a lot of focus is on Gaza today, more so than usual, is because an absolutely horrific scene unfolded where some convoys of humanitarian aid, food and medicine and other items that Gazans need for survival were entering Gaza, in northern Gaza. And just imagine if you have children or parents or elderly people or young children near you who are wasting away from starvation, and then you see a truck filled with food, imagine what you would do. And so a very intense scene of very desperate people broke out, and within a short period of time, dozens, if not more of them, were dead. And the Gazans claim that they were all killed or mostly killed because the Israeli military opened fire and shot them. The Israeli military claims that most of them were killed because they were trampled on because of the crush of the people trying to get to these trucks and the fights that broke out and the stampede that ensued. But the Israeli military admits that they also shot at several of the people, or many of the people there. They claim that they only shot at them when they began approaching because the Israeli military felt fearful and so started shooting at their kneecaps. But the Israelis admit that at least some of them died through Israelis opening fire. I don't really know how a highly sophisticated military occupying a land with tanks and all kinds of weaponry and intelligence and tech can feel sufficiently frightened by an unarmed group of people to just open fire on them when they're desperately trying to get food. But that's what the Israeli claim is. Here's from the New York Times today. As hungry Gazans crowd a convoy, a crush of bodies, Israeli gunshots, and a deadly toll. Quote, Israeli forces opened fire while a crowd was gathered on Thursday near a convoy of trucks carrying desperately needed aid to Gaza City. Part of a chaotic scene in which scores of people were killed and injured, according to Gazan health officials and the Israeli military. The details of what happened were unclear, with officials from both sides offering starkly different accounts. The Gazan health ministry said in a statement that more than 100 people were killed and more than 700 injured in a, quote, massacre. Israeli military officials said most of the casualties were from a stampede of Gazans as they crushed around the aid trucks, and that soldiers had fired only after a crowd separately approached them in a threatening way. Israeli military spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said in a televised briefing that the soldiers opened fire, quote, only in face of danger when the mob moved in a manner which endangered them. Now, let us remember that from the start of the war, the Israelis have vowed at the highest levels of the government that they would cut off food and water on purpose to the Gazans. Not that they wouldn't provide it, but that they would blockade anyone else from trying to send aid in. And that is something that they have absolutely done. Now, here is a account of what happened, which is from Axios, that just gives a little more detail. Dozens of Palestinians killed in incident around Gaza aid convoy. An IDF official told reporters that shortly after the trucks crossed the Israeli military checkpoint on the way to Gaza City, thousands of Palestinian civilians arrived in the area and many began looting the trucks. The IDF released a drone video showing Palestinians crowding around and looting the trucks. The IDF official said Israeli forces fired on dozens of Palestinian civilians who approached the IDF and got within tens of meters. According to the official, the soldiers felt threatened and initially fired warning shots. They then fired at the legs of the Palestinians, who continued their approach, the official claimed, adding that most casualties were the result of the stampede or truck drivers running over people. Here is the drone footage released by the IDF. It's a silent video, but you can see just the desperate crowd gathering at these convoys. What are you doing? So you're seeing here a drone footage with a huge number of people, and they're gathered wherever the trucks are. They're gathered in numbers. You can see them kind of scampering and running around in a very misdirected and chaotic way. These are obviously desperate people who have been cut off from food for a long time, cut off from sustenance for a long time. And I think the IDF believes that this is designed to show that somehow, though you can't see anybody being trampled or stampeded, that it's the kind of an environment that might lead to that. You see people running, desperately trying to get food off the truck. And there are definitely a lot of people here. There are a lot of people gathered in a very densely packed way. You can see in a closer footage here, there are those trucks, the convoys of the trucks, and there are people running up to them, trying to grab things off of them. This is what desperate, starving people do, who have been victimized by a siege for now almost 6 months. These are people who survived bombing, who watch people die all around them, who are internally displaced. They're jumping on the trucks. They're trying to take things off the trucks. Behavior that I at least think is extremely understandable if you're somebody who is in Gaza and surrounded by the kind of famine and death that has surrounded them. Now, here is the Israeli Interior Minister, Ben-Gvir, who is considered one of the more extremist people in the Israeli government. And at first, the Israeli government was trying to deny that any of the people who died were killed because the Israelis opened fire on them. And yet, this is the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who came out in a tweet and seemed to contradict that denial by celebrating the fact that the Israeli military did what they should have done, which is opening fire on the Gazans. Here's what he tweeted, quote, he tweeted this in Hebrew, and this is the English translation, quote, "Total support must be given to our heroic fighters operating in Gaza, who acted excellently against a Gazan mob that tried to harm them. Today it was proven that the transfer of humanitarian aid to Gaza is not only madness, while our abductees are being held in the strip under substandard conditions, but also endangers the IDF soldiers. This is another clear reason why we must stop transferring this aid, which is in fact aid to harm the IDF soldiers and oxygen to Hamas." So you hear people inside the Israeli government, at the highest levels of the Israeli government, explicitly saying it's a mistake to let any aid in. We shouldn't be allowing any aid in at all. Now, one of the bizarre parts of this has always been that people continue to justify everything the Israelis are doing by pointing to the hostages that were taken. Over 100 hostages still remain, between the ones who were returned, the ones who have died in Israeli bombardment. And it seems like a very odd framework to say, well, we're doing everything to try and save the hostages when you're mass bombing, indiscriminately bombing exactly the places where you know the hostages are. Obviously, you're going to kill a lot of the hostages you're claiming you're trying to rescue. And a lot of the hostages who have been released said that they ate very poorly, but that they ate exactly the same thing as their captors were eating. Their captors were sharing the same food with them and giving them the same portions. Because obviously, if you blockade an area and prevent food from coming in, and you starve the population to death, that's going to also end up starving the hostages that you claim you're trying to save. So it's always been a very bizarre rationale to say we're bombing massively and we're starving this area where our hostages are because we want to save our hostages. It seems far more likely that you're going to end up killing them. Now, people will automatically dismiss, a lot of people will, whatever the Palestinian Health Authority says in Gaza by claiming, oh, well, that's controlled by Hamas, even though they have a record of providing very accurate data about how many people have been killed in previous Israeli campaigns. And then, of course, if there's any journalists inside Gaza, they'll dismiss that and say, well, these are Hamas spokespeople. So then what are you left with in terms of trying to understand what's happening in Gaza? Well, there are aid groups, aid organizations that go around the world risking their lives in war zones to try and provide humanitarian assistance to a certain population. And those rights groups have been very clear that the only reason why people in Gaza are deprived of aid and deprived of food is because the Israelis refuse to let any in, that they're deliberately starving the Palestinians. Here from The Guardian this week, Israel is deliberately starving Palestinians, UN rights expert says. UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, said denial of food is a war crime and constitutes, quote, a situation of genocide. Quote, nutrition screenings at health centers and shelters in January found almost 16% of children under the age of 2, the equivalent of 1 in 6 infants, were acutely malnourished or wasting in northern Gaza, where 300,000 people are trapped with virtually no food and being allowed in by Israel. Of these, almost 3% are suffering from severe wasting, at high risk of medical complications or death without urgent help, according to a recent UN report. Reports have emerged of parents feeding their children animal feed in hope of keeping them alive. In Rafah in the south, where Israel is currently focusing military attacks, 5% of children under 2 years were acutely malnourished. Internationally starving civilians by, quote, depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies, is a war crime, according to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Indispensable objects include food, water, and shelter, which Israel is systematically denying Palestinians. Starvation is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute. Now, for those of you who think to yourself, well, this is not really my business, this is not really my war, remember that this war is as much of an American war as it is an Israeli war. That's how the world perceives it, for a good reason, because it's factually true that the U.S. is paying for this war, the U.S. is financing this war, the U.S. is providing Israel with the weapons and the arms that it's using to carry all of this out. The U.S. is isolating itself on the world stage by vetoing any attempts to call for a ceasefire. So in every sense of the world, this is an American war. If you are an American citizen, you're paying for this war. Your government is incurring all kinds of costs to enable it. This is not just a war on the other side of the world. This is an American war, every bit as much as the war in Ukraine is. Here from the AP today, a quarter of Gaza's population is one step from famine and aid trucks are looted, UN says. At least 1/4 of Gaza's population, 576,000 people, are one step away from famine, and virtually the entire population desperately needs food, resulting in some aid trucks being shot at, looted, and overwhelmed by hungry people, top UN officials said Tuesday. The officials from the UN Humanitarian Office and the UN's food and agricultural organizations painted a dire picture for all 2.3 million people in Gaza, facing crisis levels of food insecurity or worse, and civil order breaking down, especially in the north where food and other humanitarian supplies are scarce. And as grim as the picture is today, UN Humanitarian Coordinator Ramesh Ramaskan told the UN Security Council that there is every possibility for further deterioration. Carl Scow, Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Program, said that this is, quote, the worst level of child malnutrition anywhere in the world. And he warned that, quote, if nothing changes, a famine is imminent in northern Gaza. Israel's Deputy UN Ambassador Brett Miller told the Council that while fighting Hamas, it is doing, quote, all it can to care for civilians and is working constantly to ensure the entry of humanitarian aid from numerous countries and U.S. aid agencies. CNN has been a very vocal supporter of the Israeli government and the Israeli war from the start. You had anchors on CNN like Jake Tapper and Dana Bash that have spoken of their personal connection to Israel. Dana Bash said a prayer for Israel on one of the CNN shows on October 8th or October 9th, a Jewish prayer for Israel. Their coverage has been almost uniformly positive in terms of the Israeli perspective. Yesterday, though, they had on to their program, and this was, I believe, a version of international CNN, that's hosted by Isa Soares. And here is an Irish nurse, I believe she's Irish, who works with one of these aid organizations. And I just want you to listen to what she said, having been to Gaza, having all kinds of colleagues in Gaza that she's worked with, a long time, healthcare workers and others, about the situation in Gaza. Here's what she has to say.
Just explain first to our viewers why aid isn't being allowed in. Where is the aid?
It's very simple. It's because the Israeli military won't let it in. We could end this starvation tomorrow very simply if they would just let us have access to people there, but it's not being allowed. This is what they said on the 7th of October. Nothing will go in, and so it remains the case. And for people in the north of Gaza, it's even worse because no food is reaching them anymore. And so my own staff, my own colleague Abir, has been eating animal feed, and horrifyingly, the food that they were eating, which is food for horse and donkeys, is now running out, and now they're eating bird seed. The statistics also tell their own story. 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 in the north of Gaza are now acutely malnourished. This is the fastest decline in a population's nutrition status ever recorded, and what that means is that children are being starved at the fastest rate the world has ever seen. And we could finish it tomorrow. We could save them all, but we're not being able to.
I mean, I presume you heard in process what she said. She said that children are being starved at the fastest rate we have ever seen. And unless you want to just dismiss every single healthcare worker, every dedicated aid organization as somehow propagandistic against Israel, all willing to lie collectively for some reason. I know it's kind of a human impulse to believe that human suffering and humanitarian catastrophe on this scale probably isn't happening. It's a comforting belief to convince ourselves or lure ourselves into accepting. The evidence is just overwhelming. It's overwhelming. If you just listen to any of the people who have been to Gaza, who have colleagues there, everything they're describing is very uniform. The data proves it. Neutral aid organizations are all saying the same thing, that this is a catastrophe on a scale unlike anything they've ever seen. Here is a different video from earlier this week of other aid when it appears, watch what happens, how desperate the people in Gaza are as they try and just get some of it for their family. This is why social order is breaking down. Thousands of hungry Palestinians scrambled to retrieve aid packages. Airdrop by the Jordanian army. So they're dropping them in sea. People went out to sea to collect them. But it wasn't clear if all could be saved. And you see people walking around in massive numbers. Rights groups say that what little aid was reaching Gaza has decreased dramatically. Israeli forces are accused of targeting trucks and firing on civilians, as well as severely restricting the amount of aid getting in by road. Last week, the World Food Program suspended aid to northern Gaza due to, quote, complete chaos and violence. The UN says at least 500,000 people are facing famine in Gaza. Red Cross officials say airdropping aid is seen as, quote, a last resort. And you see some video there of food being airdropped. Now, the United States actually leaked reports from the Biden White House today saying that the United States was considering airdropping humanitarian aid in Gaza because not even the United States can get aid into Gaza because Israel won't allow it. So here we are paying for Israel's war. We're financing Israel's war. They're a patron state of ours. We give them $4 billion every year, and then every time they have a war, they get billions more. They ask for billions more. We transfer arms to them on a level, whatever they ask for. And yet, the position of the Biden administration is that we have no leverage over Israel, that they're a sovereign state, they do what they want, even though we're the ones on whom they're relying to fight this war. And according to the Biden administration, they won't even let the United States deliver aid to Gaza, which of course the United States wants to do, if for no other reason than to placate voting constituencies on whom Biden will rely this year, and if he wants to have any chance of being reelected. It just shows you this bizarre relationship that we finance Israel, we arm Israel, we shield them at the UN, and yet whenever we ask them to do something or whenever we tell them that something that they're doing is contrary to our interests, they do it anyway. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.